Gliding is a recreational activity and competitive air sport in which pilots fly unpowered aircraft known as gliders or sailplanes using naturally occurring currents of rising air in the atmosphere to remain airborne. The word soaring is also used for the sport. Gliding as a sport began in the 1920s. Initially the objective was to increase the duration of flights, but soon pilots attempted cross-country flights away from the place of launch. Improvements in aerodynamics and in the understanding of weather phenomena have allowed greater distances at higher average speeds. Long distances are now flown using any of the main sources of rising air: ridge lift, thermals and lee waves. When conditions are favorable, experienced pilots can now fly hundreds of kilometers before returning to the home airfields. Occasionally flights of more than 1,000 kilometers are achieved. Some competitive pilots fly in races around predefined courses. These gliding competitions test pilots' abilities to make best use of local weather conditions as well as the flying skills. Local and national competitions are organized in many countries, and there are biennial World Gliding Championships. Techniques to maximize a glider's speed around the day's task in a competition have been developed, including the optimum speed to fly, navigation using GPS and the carrying of water ballast. If the weather deteriorates, pilots are sometimes unable to complete a cross-country flight. Consequently, they may need to land elsewhere, perhaps in a field, but motor glider pilots can avoid this by starting an engine-powered aircraft, and winches are the two most common means of launching gliders. These and other launch methods require assistance and facilities such as airfields, tugs, and winches. These are usually provided by gliding clubs, who also train new pilots and maintain high safety standards. Although in most countries the standards of safety of the pilots and the aircraft are the responsibility of governmental bodies, the clubs and sometimes national gliding associations often have delegated authority. History: the development of heavier-than-air flight in the half-century between Sir George Cayley's Coachman in 1853 and the Wright brothers mainly involved gliders. However, the sport of gliding only emerged after the First World War as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed severe restrictions on the manufacture and use of single-seat powered aircraft in Germany's Weimar Republic. Thus, in the 1920s and 1930s, while aviators and aircraft makers in the rest of the world were working to improve the performance of powered aircraft, the Germans were designing, developing and flying ever more efficient gliders and discovering ways of using the natural forces in the atmosphere to make them fly farther and faster. With the active support of the German government, there were 50,000 glider pilots by 1937. The first German gliding competition was held at the Wasser Cup in 1920, organized by Oskar Ersness. The best flight lasted 2 minutes and set a world distance record of 2 kilometers. Within 10 years, it had become an international event in which the achieved durations and distances had increased greatly. In 1931, Günther Gronhoff flew 272 kilometers on the front of a storm from Munich to Kadaň in western Czechoslovakia, farther than had been thought possible. In the 1930s, gliding spread to many other countries. In the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, gliding was a demonstration sport, and it was scheduled to be a full Olympic sport in the 1940 Games. A glider, the Olympia, was developed in Germany for the event, but World War II intervened. By 1939 the major gliding records were held by Russians, including a distance record of 748 kilometers. During the war, the sport of gliding in Europe was largely suspended, though several German fighter aces in the conflict, including Erich Hartmann, began their flight training in gliders. Gliding did not return to the Olympics after the war for two reasons: a shortage of gliders, and the failure to agree on a single model of competition glider. The reintroduction of air sports such as gliding to the Olympics has occasionally been proposed by the world governing body, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, but has been rejected on the grounds of lack of public interest. In many countries during the 1950s, a large number of trained pilots wanted to continue flying. Many were also aeronautical engineers who could design, build and maintain gliders. They started both clubs and manufacturers, many of which still exist. This stimulated the development of both gliding and gliders. For example, the membership of the Soaring Society of America increased from 1,000 to 16,000 by 1980. The increased numbers of pilots, greater knowledge and improving technology helped set new records. For example, the pre-war altitude record was doubled by 1950, and the first 1,000-kilometer flight was achieved in 1964. New materials such as glass fiber and carbon fiber, advances in wing shapes and airfoils, electronic instruments, the global positioning system and improved weather forecasting have since allowed many pilots to make flights that were once extraordinary. Today over 550 pilots have made flights over 1,000 kilometers. Although there is no Olympic competition, there are the World Gliding Championships. The first event was held at the Samoan in 1948. Since World War II it has been held every 2 years. There are now 6 classes open to both sexes, plus 3 classes for women and 2 junior classes. The latest worldwide statistics for 2011 indicate that Germany, the sport's birthplace, is still a center of the gliding world. It accounted for 27% of the world's glider pilots, and the 3 major glider manufacturers are still based there. However, the meteorological conditions that allow soaring are common and the sport has been taken up in many countries. At the last count there were over 111,000 active civilian glider pilots and 32,920 gliders, plus an unknown number of military cadets and aircraft. Clubs actively seek new members by giving trial flights, which are also a useful source of revenue for them. Soaring. Glider pilots can stay airborne 4 hours by flying through air that is ascending as fast or faster than the glider itself is descending, thus gaining potential energy. The most commonly used sources of rising air are thermals, ridge lift, and wave lift. Ridge lift really allows pilots to climb much higher than about 600 meters above the terrain. Thermals, depending on the climate and terrain, can allow climbs in excess of 3,000 meters in flat country and much higher above mountains. Wave lift has allowed a glider to reach an altitude of 15,447 meters. In a few countries such as the UK, gliders may continue to climb into the clouds in uncontrolled airspace, but in many European countries the pilot must stop climbing before reaching the cloud base. Thermals are streams of rising air that are formed on the ground through the warming of the surface by sunlight. If the air contains enough moisture, the water will condense from the rising air and form cumulus clouds. When the air has little moisture, or when an inversion stops the warm air from rising high enough for the moisture to condense, thermals do not create cumulus clouds. Without clouds or dust devils to mark the thermals, thermals are not always associated with any feature on the ground. The pilot must then use both skill and luck to find them using a sensitive vertical speed indicator called a variometer that quickly indicates climbs and descents. Occasionally reliable thermals can be found in the exhaust gases from power stations or from fires. Once a thermal is encountered, the pilot can fly in tight circles to keep the glider within the thermal, gaining altitude before flying towards the destination or to the next thermal. This is known as thermaling. Alternatively, glider pilots on cross-country flights may choose to dolphin. This is when the pilot merely slows down in rising air and then speeds up again in the non-rising air, thus following an undulating flight path. Dolphining allows the pilot to minimize the loss of height over great distances without spending time turning. Climb rates depend on conditions, but rates of several meters per second are common and can be maximized by gliders equipped with flaps. Thermals can also be formed in a line, usually because of the wind or the terrain, creating cloud streets. These can allow the pilot to fly straight while climbing in continuous lift. As it requires rising heated air, thermaling is most effective in mid-latitudes from spring through late summer. During winter the sun's heat can only create weak thermals, but ridge and wave lift can still be used during this period. Ridge lift. A ridge soaring pilot uses upward air movements caused when the wind blows onto the sides of hills. It can also be augmented by thermals when the slopes also face the sun. In places where a steady wind blows, a ridge may allow virtually unlimited time aloft. Although records for duration are no longer recognized because of the danger of exhaustion, wave lift, the powerfully rising and sinking air in mountain waves, was discovered by glider pilot Wolf Hirth in 1933. Gliders can sometimes climb in these waves to great altitudes, although pilots must use supplementary oxygen to avoid hypoxia. This lift is often marked by long, stationary lenticular clouds lying perpendicular to the wind. Mountain wave was used to set the current altitude record of 15,453 meters on the 29th of August 2006 over El Calafate, Argentina. The pilots, Steve Fossett and Einar Enevoldsen, wore pressure suits. The current world distance record of 3,008 kilometers by Klaus Ullmann was also flown using mountain waves in South America. A rare wave phenomenon is known as morning glory, a roll cloud producing strong lift. Pilots near Australia's Gulf of Carpentaria make use of it in springtime. Other sources of lift, the boundaries where two air masses meet, are known as convergence zones. These can occur in sea breezes or in desert regions. In a sea breeze front, cold air from the sea meets the warmer air from the land and creates a boundary between two masses of air like a shallow cold front. Glider pilots can gain altitude by flying along the intersection as if it were a ridge of land. Convergence may occur over considerable distances and so may permit virtually straight flight while climbing. Glider pilots have occasionally been able to use a technique called dynamic soaring, allowing a glider to gain kinetic energy by repeatedly crossing the boundary between air masses of different horizontal velocity. However, such zones of high wind gradient are usually too close to the ground to be used safely by gliders. Launch methods. Most gliders do not have engines, or at least engines that would allow a takeoff under their own power. Various methods are therefore used to get airborne. Each method requires specific training, therefore glider pilots must be in current practice for the type of launch being used. Licensing rules in some countries, such as the USA, differentiate between aerotowers and ground launch methods, due to the widely different techniques. Aerotowing. In an aerotower-powered aircraft is attached to a glider with a tow rope. Single-engined light aircraft or motor gliders are commonly used. The tow plane takes the glider to the height and location requested by the pilot, where the glider pilot releases the tow rope. A weak link is often fitted to the rope to ensure that any sudden loads do not damage the airframe of the tow plane or the glider. Under extreme loads, the weak link will fail before any part of the glider or plane fails. There is a remote chance that the weak link might break at low altitude, and so pilots plan for this eventuality before launching. During the aerotow, the glider pilot keeps the glider behind the tow plane in either the low tow position, just below the wake from the tow plane, or the high tow position just above the wake. In Australia, the convention is to fly in low tow, whereas in the United States and Europe the high tow prevails. One rare aerotow variation is attaching two gliders to one tow plane, using a short rope for the high-towed glider and a long rope for the low-tow. The current record is 9 gliders in the same aerotow. Winch launching gliders are often launched using a stationary ground-based winch mounted on a heavy vehicle. This method is widely used at many European clubs, often in addition to an aerotow service. The engine is usually a large diesel, gasoline or LPG engine, though hydraulic fluid engines and electrical motors are also used. The winch pulls in a 1,000 to 2,500 meter cable made of high-tensile steel wire or a synthetic fiber attached to the glider. The cable is released at a height of about half the cable length after a short, steep ride. Strong winches, light gliders and strong headwind result in higher launches. Winch launches are much cheaper than aerotows, permit a higher takeoff frequency and have the advantage that many members of a club can be taught to operate the equipment. A winch may also be used at sites where an aerotow could not operate because of the shape of the field or because of noise restrictions. The height gained from a winch is usually less than from an aerotow, so pilots need to find a source of lift soon after releasing from the cable, otherwise the flight will be short. A break in the cable or the weak link during a winch launch is a possibility for which pilots are trained. Auto-tow, another method of launching. The auto-tow is rarer nowadays. The direct auto-tow requires a hard surface and a powerful vehicle that is attached to the glider by a long steel cable. After gently taking up slack in the cable, the driver accelerates hard and as a result the glider rises rapidly to about 400 meters, especially if there is a good headwind and a runway of 1.5 kilometers or more. This method has also been used on desert dry lakes. A variation on the direct auto-tow is known as the reverse pulley method. In this method, the truck drives towards the glider being launched. The cable passes around a pulley at the far end of the airfield, resulting in an effect similar to that of a winch launch. Bungee launch. Bungee launching was widely used in the early days of gliding, and occasionally gliders are still launched from the top of a gently sloping hill into a strong breeze using a substantial multi-stranded rubber band, or bungee. For this launch method, the glider's main wheel rests in a small concrete trough. The hook normally used for winch launching is instead attached to the middle of the bungee. Each end is then pulled by 3 or 4 people. One group runs slightly to the left, the other to the right. Once the tension in the bungee is high enough, the glider is released and the glider's wheel pops out of the trough. The glider gains just enough energy to leave the ground and fly away from the hill. Cross-country. One of the measures of a glider's performance is the distance that it can fly for each meter it descends, known as its glide ratio. Glide ratio is dependent on an aircraft's class and can typically range from 44 to 1 up to 70 to 1. A good gliding performance combined with regular sources of rising air enables modern gliders to fly long distances at high speeds. The weather is a major factor in determining cross-country speeds. The record average speed for 1,000 kilometers is 203.1 kilometers per hour. required unusually good conditions. But even in places with less favorable conditions, a skilled pilot could expect to complete flights over 500 kilometers every year. As the performance of gliders improved in the 1960s, the concept of flying as far away as possible became unpopular with the crews who had to retrieve the gliders. Pilots now usually plan to fly around a course via turn points, returning to the starting point. In addition to just trying to fly further, glider pilots also race each other in competitions. The winner is the fastest, or, if the weather conditions are poor, the furthest round the course. Tasks of up to 1,000 kilometers have been set, and average speeds of 120 kilometers per hour are not unusual. Initially, ground observers confirmed that pilots had rounded the turn points. Later, the glider pilots photographed these places and submitted the film for verification. Today, gliders carry secure GNSS flight recorders that record the position every few seconds from GPS satellites. These recording devices now provide the proof that the turn points have been reached. National competitions generally last 1 week, with international championships running over 2. The winner is the pilot who has amassed the greatest number of points over all the contest days. However, these competitions have as yet failed to draw much interest outside the gliding community for several reasons. Because it would be unsafe for many gliders to cross the start line at the same time, pilots can choose their own start time. Furthermore, gliders are not visible to the spectators for long periods during each day's contest, and the scoring is complex, so traditional gliding competitions are difficult to televise. In an attempt to widen the sport's appeal, a new format, the Grand Prix, has been introduced. Innovations introduced in the Grand Prix format include simultaneous starts for a small number of gliders, cockpit-mounted cameras, telemetry giving the positions of the gliders, tasks consisting of multiple circuits, and simplified scoring. There is a decentralized internet-based competition called the online contest, in which pilots upload the GPS data files and are automatically scored based on distance flown. Worldwide, 6,703 pilots registered for this contest in 2010. Maximizing average speed. Soaring pioneer Paul McCready is usually credited with developing mathematical principles for optimizing the speed at which to fly when cross-country soaring. Although it was first described by Wolfgang Spate in 1938. The speed-to-fly theory allows the optimal cruising speed between thermals to be computed, using thermal strength, glider performance and other variables. It accounts for the fact that if a pilot flies faster between thermals, the next thermal is reached sooner. However, at higher speeds the glider also sinks faster, requiring the pilot to spend more time circling to regain the altitude. The McCready speed represents the optimal trade-off between cruising and circling. Most competition pilots use McCready theory to optimize their average speeds, and have the calculations programmed in their flight computers, or use a McCready ring, a rotatable bezel on the glider's variometer to indicate the best speed to fly. The greatest factor in maximizing average speed, however, remains the ability of the pilot to find the strongest lift. On cross-country flights on days when strong lift is forecast, pilots fly with water ballast stored in tanks or bags in the wings and fin. The fin tank is used to reduce trim drag by optimizing the center of gravity, which typically would shift forward if water is stored only in the wings ahead of the spar. Ballast enables a sailplane to attain its best LD at higher speeds but slows its climb rate in thermals, in part because a sailplane with a heavier wing loading cannot circle within a thermal as tightly as one with a lower unballasted wing loading. But if lift is strong, typically either from thermals or wave, the disadvantage of slower climbs is outweighed by the higher cruising speeds between lift areas. Thus, the pilot can improve the average speed over a course by several percent or achieve longer distances in a given time. If lift is weaker than expected, or if an off-field landing is imminent, the pilot can jettison the water ballast by opening the dump valves. On days with particularly strong and widespread lift, pilots can attain high average speeds by alternating periods of fast flight with pull-ups, merely slowing down in areas of lift without deviating from the course. This dolphining technique can result in high average speeds because the height lost can be minimized until particularly strong lift is encountered, when circling would be most effective. Badges. Achievements in gliding have been marked by the awarding of badges since the 1920s. For the lower badges, such as the first solo flight, national gliding federations set their own criteria. Typically, a bronze badge shows preparation for cross-country flight, including precise landings and witnessed soaring flights. Higher badges follow the standards set down by the Gliding Commission of the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. The FAI's sporting code defines the rules for observers and recording devices to validate the claims for badges that are defined by kilometers of distance and meters of altitude gained. The Silver Sea badge was introduced in 1930. Earning the silver badge shows that a glider pilot has achieved an altitude gain of at least 1,000 meters, made a 5-hour duration flight, and has flown cross-country for a straight-line distance of at least 50 kilometers. These three attainments are usually, but not invariably, achieved in separate flights. The gold and diamond badges require pilots to fly higher and further. A pilot who has completed the three parts of the diamond badge has flown 300 kilometers to a predefined goal, has flown 500 kilometers in one flight and gained 5,000 meters in height. The FAI also issues a diploma for a flight of 1,000 kilometers and further diplomas for increments of 250 kilometers. Landing out of lift is not found during a cross-country flight, for example because of deteriorating weather. The pilot must choose a location to land out. Although inconvenient and often mistaken for emergency landings, landing out is a routine event in cross-country gliding. The pilot has to choose a location where the glider can be landed safely without damaging the plane, the pilot, or property such as crops or livestock. The glider and the pilot can then be retrieved by road from the outlanding location using a purpose-built trailer. In some instances, a tow plane can be summoned to relaunch the aircraft. Use of engines or motors. Although adding to the weight and expense, some gliders are fitted with small power units and are known as motor gliders. This avoids the inconvenience of landing out. The power units can be internal combustion engines, electrical motors, or retractable jet engines. Retractable propellers are fitted to high-performance sailplanes, though in another category, called touring motor gliders, non-retractable propellers are used. Some powered gliders are self-launching, which makes the glider independent of a tow plane. However, some gliders have sustainer engines that can prolong flight but are not powerful enough for launching. All power units have to be started at a height that includes a margin that would still allow a safe landing out to be made, if there were a failure to start. In a competition, using the engine ends the soaring flight. Unpowered gliders are lighter and, as they do not need a safety margin for starting the engine, they can safely thermal at lower altitudes in weaker conditions. Consequently, pilots in unpowered gliders may complete competition flights when some powered competitors cannot. Conversely, motor glider pilots can start the engine if conditions will no longer support soaring flight, while unpowered gliders will have to land out, away from the home airfield, requiring retrieval by road using the glider's trailer. Aerobatic competitions. World and European aerobatic competitions are held regularly. In this type of competition, the pilots fly a program of maneuvers. Each maneuver has a rating called the K factor. Maximum points are given for the maneuver if it is flown perfectly, otherwise points are deducted. Efficient maneuvers also enable the whole program to be completed with the height available. The winner is the pilot with the most points.